In the late summer of 1847, a wagon train composed of 14 families crossed over the eastern rim of a valley in the Oregon Territory. A valley that appeared on no official map issued by the United States government. Their entry occurred on the morning of August 31st, a Monday, beneath a sky the lead scout would later describe, in a letter to his brother in Cincinnati, as the clearest and most beautiful he had witnessed in 3 decades of frontier travel. The valley, perhaps 6 miles wide at its broadest point and maybe 12 miles long, was ringed on 3 sides by stands of old-growth Douglas fir so dense that the light seemed to die at their edges, much as light fades at the edge of deep water. Through its center ran a river, cold and swift and so clear that a man could discern the color of the stones 20 feet below the surface. There was good grass in the bottomland. There were natural springs along the western slope. And there was, according to the scout Elias Caldwell, a stillness in the air of that place that he could not entirely attribute to any feature of the landscape. A stillness that was not precisely peaceful, but rather the particular silence of a room that has just been vacated by someone you cannot name. The 14 families, 106 people in total, counting the hired hands and the 2 unmarried sisters traveling with the Beaumont party, had been on the trail since April. They had come from 5 different counties in Ohio and Kentucky, recruited by a land agent named Cornelius Fitch, who maintained offices on the 2nd floor of a dry goods store in Chillicothe, and who, by the spring of 1847, had sold parcels of Oregon Territory land to more than 300 families across 6 states. Fitch was a careful man in his business dealings, meticulous about his contracts, scrupulous about his receipts, and, by every account left to us, a thorough and deliberate liar. The land he sold did not belong to him. The surveys he provided had been fabricated in the back room of the dry goods store by a draftsman named Horace Pell, who charged $2 per map, and who later testified in an 1851 federal inquiry, quietly buried before any findings were published, that he had drawn some of those maps from memory, some from other maps, and at least 7 of them entirely from imagination, including one that Pell could identify from the description as the map given to the Harrowfield party. The valley had a name, though it would not appear in any government record under that name until 1889, long after the events of 1847 had been officially categorized as an emigrant accident and filed away in a drawer in the General Land Office in Washington, a drawer that was not opened again until 1923. The local Kalapuya people, some of whom still lived in the hill country surrounding the valley at that time, called it by a word that the single surviving translation, produced by an ethnographer named Josephine Marsh in 1904 from the account of an elderly Kalapuya man she identified only as Thomas, rendered it as the swallowing place. Thomas, who would have been a young man of perhaps 20 in 1847, told Marsh that the valley had been avoided by his people for as long as anyone could remember, and that the avoidance was not a superstition, in the way educated white people use that word, meaning an irrational fear of something harmless, but was instead a practical response to something observed and documented across many generations in his community's oral traditions. For when Marsh pressed him to be specific, he said only that the valley kept what it took, and that what it preferred to take was groups, never individuals, and that it had a particular patience with groups that came in believing they had found something good. Elias Caldwell had been hired by Cornelius Fitch in the spring of 1847 to lead the wagon train from the Kansas outfitting post at Westport to the land parcels in the Oregon Territory. Caldwell was 53 years old, a former Army surveyor who had served under General Winfield Scott in the Seminole campaigns and who had made the overland crossing twice before, in 1841 and in 1844. He was a lean, quiet man with a habit of whittling small animals from pieces of trail wood and leaving them on rocks along the path for children to find. He was known among the emigrant families. He guided as a man of steady judgment who did not speak unless he had something worth saying. He had been paid $70,000 for the crossing, half in advance and half upon delivery. In his possession was a copy of the Pell map, which he had examined carefully in Westport, and which had given him a specific unease he could not entirely resolve. The landmarks on the map did not match any territory he had personally surveyed, and 2 of the river crossings it indicated were in locations that contradicted his own experience of the watershed. He had raised these concerns with Fitch in a letter sent from Westport in early April, and Fitch had replied by courier with a note that read in its entirety, "The surveys are correct. Proceed as planned. Your second payment depends on delivery." Caldwell, who had a wife and 3 daughters in Springfield, Ohio, and who had not worked a full season in 2 years, proceeded as planned. The families themselves were unremarkable in the way most American families of that era were unremarkable. Which is to say, they were complicated, imperfect, hopeful, frightened, and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. The Harrowfield family, from whose name the incident would eventually take its designation, was headed by a man named Absalom Harrowfield, 44 years old, a former schoolteacher from Muskingum County who had sold his house, his small library, and his wife's piano to buy 2 land parcels from Cornelius Fitch, and who had convinced his brother-in-law, a farmer named Seth Crane, to buy 2 more. Absalom's wife was named Catherine, 39, a woman of considerable intelligence and organizational ability, who had kept a journal of the crossing from the first day out of Westport, and whose handwriting, in the fragments that survive, was so small and precise that a magnifying glass is required to read it comfortably. They had 4 children, a son named Elijah, 17, who had his mother's careful handwriting and his father's tendency toward silence, a daughter named Ruth, 14, who was, by all surviving accounts, the kind of girl who could make friends with a stone wall, a son named Daniel, 9, who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a corn sheller the previous autumn, and who had adapted to this loss with a cheerfulness his parents found both admirable and slightly unnerving, and the youngest, a girl named Mercy, 4 years old, who had been sick with a chest cold for most of the crossing, and whose coughing at night was the sound Elias Caldwell, sleeping 30 yards from the Harrowfield wagon, associated ever afterward with the approach of that valley. The Beaumont party, traveling alongside the Harrowfields, consisted of a widower named George Beaumont, 58, a former county judge from Bourbon County, Kentucky, who wore his black judicial coat, even on the trail, and carried in his breast pocket a daguerreotype of his late wife that he showed to anyone who sat beside him at the evening fire for more than 10 minutes. With him traveled his son Nathaniel, 26, who did not share his father's sentimentality, and was known among the other travelers as a capable and somewhat cold young man who could shoe a horse in under 12 minutes and rarely laughed. The 2 unmarried sisters traveling with the Beaumont party were named Dorothea and Constance Fells, ages 31 and 28 respectively, daughters of a Methodist minister from Xenia, Ohio, who had died the previous winter and left them with a modest inheritance, most of which they had spent on their land parcels and outfitting. Dorothea kept a separate journal from Catherine Harrowfield's, and the 2 journals read together, give us the most complete picture we have of the party's state of mind during the final weeks of the crossing. The remaining 11 families are known to us primarily through the census records of the counties they left behind and through the federal missing persons register compiled in 1849. by a clerk in the general land office named Augustus Trevelyan, who had been asked to determine why 106 settlers had not appeared at the land office in Oregon City to file their claims. Trevelyan's register is a remarkable document. 16 pages of careful handwriting that names every member of the party, gives their ages and counties of origin, notes the value of property they had sold before departure, and concludes with a single paragraph that has been quoted in the 2 academic papers ever written about the Harrowfield Incident, both published in journals with circulations under 500, neither currently in print. Trevelyan wrote in that concluding paragraph that he had been unable to determine the fate of any member of the party, that the land agent Cornelius Fitch had been located in Chillicothe and questioned, but had denied all knowledge of any irregularity in his surveys or dealings, and that in Trevelyan's considered personal opinion, which he noted was not an official finding of the land office, the 106 members of the Harrowfield wagon train had entered a piece of territory from which there was, for reasons he could not explain by any ordinary means, no exit. Trevelyan filed his register in January of 1849 and was transferred to a position in the patent office 6 weeks later, a transfer not requested by him, and that his wife described in a letter to her sister as sudden and strange, accompanied by a visit to their home by 2 men she did not know, one of whom carried a leather satchel, and neither of whom gave their names. Trevelyan himself never spoke publicly about the Harrowfield case again. He died in 1871 of what his physician recorded as a general decline, and his personal papers, which his son donated to the Library of Congress in 1889, contain no reference to the case whatsoever, with one exception. In the margin of a personal Bible, beside the 14th verse of the 23rd chapter of the Book of Numbers, Trevelyan had written in a hand his son described as very different from his father's usual careful script, as if written quickly or in the dark. 4 words. They did not leave. The crossing itself had been difficult in the way all Oregon crossings were difficult in that era, and unremarkable in most of its hardships. They had lost 2 oxen to bad water at the Platte crossing in June. A child from the Voss family, a boy of 3 named August, had died of fever in the 3rd week of July and been buried on the south bank of the Snake River under a wooden cross that Elias Caldwell had carved with the boy's name and the date and the single word, beloved, because the father, Henrik Voss, had stood at the graveside for 20 minutes, trying to find the right word, and had finally turned to Caldwell and asked him to choose. A woman from the Pendleton family, Margaret Pendleton, 41, had broken her ankle stepping from her wagon in a dry creek bed in early August and had ridden the last 3 weeks of the crossing lying in the wagon bed on a mattress of folded quilts. Her ankle set by a man named Jonas Birch, who had been a veterinarian in Clermont County, and who noted afterward, in a letter that does not survive but is quoted in Trevelyan's register, that Mrs. Pendleton bore the pain with a fortitude he had not previously associated with the female constitution, a remark she would have found both insulting and accurate. By the time they reached the eastern rim of the valley on the morning of August 31st, the party had been on the trail for 135 days. They were tired in the deep way long. Distance travelers become tired. Not physically depleted, but fundamentally altered. Their ordinary sense of what was normal and what was strange recalibrated by months of exposure to a landscape so vast and indifferent that the human eye eventually stopped trying to find the horizon and simply accepted that the world was larger than any mind could comfortably contain. In that state, the valley below them appeared, by the accounts of both Catherine Harrowfield and Dorothea Fells, as something close to a vision. Catherine wrote in the entry for August 31st that she had cried when she saw it, not from relief exactly, but from something she could not name that felt like recognition, as though some part of her had known this place before she had ever seen it. Dorothea wrote that she had heard her sister Constance say, quietly beside her on the wagon seat, that it was exactly as she had imagined it, which was strange, because Constance had never spoken of imagining any particular place. When Dorothea asked what she meant, Constance had simply smiled, shaken her head, and clicked her tongue at the horse. Elias Caldwell did not share their reaction. He sat on his horse at the rim of the valley and looked down into it for a long time without speaking. What he saw was not the good grass and the clear river and the stands of fir that the others were exclaiming over. Or rather, he saw those things, but he also saw something underneath them that he could not name and could not dismiss. The stillness he would later write about in his letter to his brother. The quiet that was not the quiet of an empty place, but the quiet of a full one, a place that had been holding its breath for some specific reason it had not yet chosen to share. He looked at the map in his hands. The valley was not marked on it, and yet the families were looking at it, as though they had always known it was here. He turned in his saddle and looked at the line of wagons behind him. 14 families strung out along the Rimrock Road, faces turned toward the valley below like flowers turning toward the sun. He felt for the first time in 30 years of frontier travel the specific fear of a man who has led people somewhere they should not be. He did not turn them back. This is the fact that would occupy the last 23 years of his life, the fact he returned to in every conversation about the incident and in every page of the memoir he began writing in 1861 and never completed. He did not turn them back. He told himself the valley was simply unfamiliar terrain, and his unease was the product of fatigue and the unsettling experience of navigating by a map he did not trust. He told himself the families deserved to see the land they had paid for, and that it was not his place to override their judgment on the basis of a feeling he could not articulate. He told himself finally that there was no reason to believe a valley with good ground and clean water and shelter from autumn winds was anything other than what it appeared to be, and that a man who turned back 106 weary travelers on the basis of a feeling deserved neither his fee nor his reputation. He gave the signal to move forward. The wagons began to descend, and the valley, as Caldwell would write in the unfinished memoir, received them the way a mouth receives something it has been waiting for. They made camp that first evening on the flat ground beside the river, near a natural clearing that appeared to have been used as a campsite before. Or so Caldwell thought, though when he examined the ground more carefully, he could find no fire rings, no post holes, no midden, none of the usual signs of previous occupation. What he found instead was a ring of stones, arranged in the grass at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. Each stone roughly the size of a man's fist, placed with a deliberateness that suggested intention, but without any pattern he could decode. He called Jonas Birch over and showed him the stones, and Birch, who had a practical man's dislike of ambiguity, said it was probably the work of the local tribes and left it at that. Caldwell said nothing further. He walked the perimeter of the camp as the sun went down and the fires were lit and the smell of cook fire smoke spread across the valley floor. And he noticed that the sound of the party, the voices and the children and the livestock, seemed to carry no distance at all in the valley air, as though the sound were being absorbed by the fir trees at the edges, or by something behind the fir trees, or by the valley itself. That night, after the fires had burned low and the families had retired to their wagons. Caldwell sat alone on a log at the edge of the stone ring and wrote in the small leather notebook he carried for scouting notes. In handwriting, the notebook's eventual custodian, a historian at the University of Oregon named Patricia Vane, described in 1978 as unusually uncertain for a man of Caldwell's demonstrated competence, the following observation: "The valley makes no echo. I have been in enclosed terrain for 30 years, and I have never been in a place that did not throw sound back in some form. Tonight I called out from the northern edge of the camp and heard nothing return. The river makes sound, the fire makes sound. The children made sound until they slept, but the valley takes the sound and does not return it. A trap takes what enters it and does not give it back. I am going to recommend tomorrow morning that we rest here 2 days and then move on to find the land office. I do not want to winter here. There is something in this place that is not for us." He did not recommend they move on in the morning. He did not recommend it because of what happened that night, after he had closed his notebook and settled down to sleep, and because of what Catherine Harrowfield recorded in her journal about the same night, and because of what Dorothea Fells wrote to her cousin in Dayton in a letter that was never sent, and that was found folded inside the back cover of her journal when the journal was discovered by means I will describe in their proper time. 61 years later. What happened that night was this. At some point in the hours between midnight and the first gray lightning of the eastern sky, every person in the camp woke up. Not gradually, not the way a person wakes from a troubling dream, but all at once and completely, as though a sound had been made that was too large for the ear to register, but not too large for the body. Catherine Harrowfield wrote that she sat up in the wagon with her heart beating at a rate she associated with physical danger, and her first instinct was to reach for her children, all 4 of whom were sleeping beside her, and all 4 of whom, she wrote, woke at the same moment she did and turned their faces toward the western slope without any apparent reason. Elijah, her eldest, said in a voice she described as not quite his own, meaning not quite the voice of a 17-year-old boy from Muskingum County, Ohio, that something was standing on the slope. She looked. In the darkness beyond the firelight, at the edge of the fir trees on the western slope, she could see nothing. She told Elijah there was nothing there. He said, without looking away, that she was looking in the wrong place. Catherine Harrowfield did not sleep again that night. She sat upright in the wagon, with her back against the curved canvas wall, her 4 children pressed around her, Mercy on her lap, Daniel against her left side with his damaged hand tucked under his chin the way he always slept, Ruth beside him, and Elijah at the far end of the wagon bed, still facing the western slope through the gap in the canvas, still and watchful in a way that made his mother think of the word sentinel. A word she had not used since her teaching days, and which arrived in her mind that night with a precision that felt borrowed rather than chosen. Absalom was outside. She could hear him moving around the wagon, his boots on the dry grass, the particular rhythm of a man trying to make ordinary sounds in an extraordinary situation. She did not call to him. She did not want to wake the children, who had drifted back to a sleep that looked, in the dim light, heavier than ordinary sleep, a sleep with too much weight in it. And she did not want to hear, in Absalom's voice, the same quality she had heard in Elijah's, that slight displacement, as though the voice were coming from a position just behind the person speaking. Dorothea Fells wrote to her cousin in Dayton, in the letter that was never sent, that she had woken that night with the absolute certainty someone was standing at the foot of her bedroll, And when she opened her eyes, she had seen, for the space of perhaps 2 seconds, the outline of a figure taller than any person she knew, and that was not standing so much as arranged, the way a person looks when they have been placed in position, rather than having arrived there by their own movement. The figure, she wrote, was gone before she could determine anything further about it, and she spent the rest of the night sitting with her sister Constance, who had also woken, and who was, Dorothea noted with a careful understatement suggesting, she understood the weight of what she was recording, entirely calm. Constance sat with her knees drawn up and her hands folded on them and looked at the western slope with an expression Dorothea described as recognitive, a word she used deliberately and then underlined, as though she knew it was the right word and wanted to make sure it was not mistaken for something else. Elias Caldwell recorded in his notebook that he had not slept. He had been awake when whatever woke the camp happened, and he had watched from his bedroll as the fires in the camp stirred without wind, and as the horses and oxen, which had been settled for the night, stood up in their lines and turned all of them to face the western slope with their ears forward and their nostrils wide. He wrote that the livestock did not panic, which he found more troubling than if they had. A panicking animal is responding to a threat. An animal that stands still and faces something with its ears forward is doing something different. It is paying attention. He wrote that he had his rifle across his knees, and that he had found, to his own surprise and considerable alarm, that he was not afraid in the way danger usually made him afraid. With the cold clarity decades of frontier experience had taught him to use as a tool. He was afraid in a different way, a way he described as interior, as if the fear were not a response to something outside him, but a communication from something inside him he had not previously known was there. A part of himself that understood something his conscious mind had not yet been given permission to understand. In the morning, nobody spoke of the night directly. This was the detail Caldwell found most remarkable, more remarkable in some ways than the night itself. 106 people had all woken in the same moment, in the middle of the night, and had experienced something that had clearly disturbed most of them profoundly. And in the morning they cooked their breakfast, watered their livestock, inspected their wagon wheels, and spoke of the day's weather, the condition of the grass, and the temperature of the river. And nobody said, "What happened last night?" or "Did you hear that?" or "Was anyone else awake?" It was not that they were hiding something from each other. Caldwell thought, watching them move around the camp in the early light. It was that they were hiding something from themselves. A different and more concerning operation entirely. He approached Absalom Harrowfield at the breakfast fire and asked how he had slept. Absalom said he had slept well. He said it with his eyes on the western slope. The decision to stay longer than 2 days was not made by any single person and was not made at any identifiable moment. It accumulated the way certain decisions do, out of small individual choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation and that only revealed their collective direction when it was already too late to reverse them easily. On the second morning, Margaret Pendleton's ankle was too swollen for her to travel, which was true and provided a practical reason to remain another day. On the third morning, one of the Voss family's oxen was lame, which was also true and provided another day. By the fourth morning, 3 of the families had begun unloading their wagons in a way that suggested not temporary rest, but the beginning of settlement. Stacking crates and furniture at the edges of the clearing, laying out the shapes of what would become living spaces. Caldwell, who had been waiting for the moment, when it would be natural to call the group together and announce they needed to move on, found that the moment had somehow passed without his noticing, the way a man who means to leave a warm room finds he has been sitting there for an hour, without any recollection of deciding to stay. He tried, on the evening of the fourth day, to raise the question directly. He sat with Absalom Harrowfield and George Beaumont at the fire after supper and said, carefully, that he was concerned about the timeline and the need to reach Oregon City before the passes close for the winter, and the fact the valley did not appear on a map he trusted, and they had no way of knowing from their current position how far they were from the nearest settlement or government outpost. George Beaumont listened with the attentive expression of a man who has presided over many courts and learned to give the appearance of consideration to arguments he has already decided to dismiss. When Caldwell finished, Beaumont said he had given the matter considerable thought himself, and it was his view that the valley offered everything the party needed and the Oregon City Land Office could wait until spring. He said this in his judicial voice, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts, and Absalom Harrowfield, who was not by nature a man who deferred to other men's judgments, nodded slowly and said he thought that was probably right. Caldwell looked at both of them for a moment. He had spent 30 years reading men in difficult terrain, and what he read in Absalom Harrowfield's face in that firelight was not agreement. It was the expression of a man repeating something he had been told. The slight delay between thought and speech. The eyes not quite on the person he was talking to, but on some point just past them. The voice that was his voice, but calibrated differently. Pitched to a frequency Caldwell associated, in the archive of his long experience, with men who were following orders from a source he could not identify and would not have been able to name if asked. He did not push further that evening. He went back to his bedroll and wrote in his notebook, in the smallest handwriting he had used since the notebook was new, a single sentence. Patricia Vane, when she examined the notebook in 1978, would spend 3 days trying to decipher before concluding it. Read, the valley has already made its decision about these people, and they are in the process of agreeing with it. The days that followed had a quality Catherine Harrowfield and Dorothea Fells struggled to describe in their journals, settling finally on words adjacent to what they meant rather than exactly precise. Catherine used the word useful. Dorothea used the word correct. Both meant something similar. The experience of being in the valley had a quality of rightness that was different from ordinary contentment, ordinary satisfaction, ordinary comfort. It was not that they were happy exactly, though they were that too, in a quiet way. It was that they felt, for the first time in their lives, and without being able to explain why, that they were in the place where they were supposed to be. A feeling so unfamiliar to women of their background and generation. Women formed by a culture that located purpose in work and duty, and the needs of others rather than in any particular place, that they did not know what to do with it. And so they wrote it down and put it away and went back to the business of building something in the valley that was beginning to look, day by day, more like permanence. By the end of the second week, 5 families had constructed the frames of rough cabins using timber from the fir trees at the valley's edge. By the end of the third week, all 14 families had begun some form of construction. Even the families who had spoken most insistently in the early days about pressing on to Oregon City. The Voss family, who had lost their son, August, to fever on the Snake River and had spoken at the evening fires in those first days of their determination to build something lasting in his memory, were the most energetic builders. Henrik Voss, who had been a carpenter in Franklin County before the emigration, worked from first light to last, and by the middle of September had raised a cabin that was, by the standards of what could be accomplished with hand tools and green timber in 3 weeks, remarkable. His wife, a small, dark-eyed woman named Liesel, planted a kitchen garden beside it before the cabin was even roofed, pressing seeds into the valley soil with a methodical confidence, suggesting she had been waiting her entire life to plant something in exactly this ground. Caldwell watched all of this with a feeling he would later describe as the purest helplessness he had ever experienced. Purer even than the helplessness of combat, because in combat you always had the option of moving your body in some direction, and what he felt in the valley was that the option of moving, of doing, of intervening in the process unfolding around him had been removed from him, not by force, but by a kind of atmospheric pressure he could not name and could not push against. He continued to make notes in his notebook. He continued to walk the perimeter of the camp each morning and evening. He continued to examine the western slope with a surveyor's eye, looking for whatever it was the slope had shown their camp on that first night, and finding, every time, nothing but the dark wall of the fir trees and the sough of the scents beyond them, that swallowed sound without returning it. He had eaten his last day's worth of provisions on September 3rd and had begun eating from the communal stores of the party, which no one objected to, since the valley had shown itself surprisingly generous in terms of game and fish, and late-season berries. The river held trout in numbers the men who fished it found almost difficult to believe. It was Jonas Birch who first began to understand what was wrong with the fish. He was the most practically observant person in the party, the veterinarian's eye trained to notice anomaly in living things. What he noticed about the fish was that they were always available in the same quantities and in the same locations and in the same state of apparent health and vigor day after day. A way that did not correspond to his understanding of how fish behaved in rivers. He had fished rivers all his life and knew fish moved, had feeding patterns and resting patterns, were affected by weather and water temperature, and the habits of the insects on which they fed. The fish in the Valley River were not affected by any of these things. They were simply present, always in numbers sufficient to feed the party, as though the river were a larder that restocked itself according to the needs of whoever was drawing from it. He mentioned this to Caldwell in early September in the careful, tentative way a practical man uses when he suspects he is about to say something that will sound impractical. Caldwell told him what he thought it meant. Birch was quiet for a long time after that, and then said he supposed a trap that intended to keep its occupants for a long time would need to feed them, and a trap that fed its occupants generously enough would be very difficult to distinguish from a home. The first attempt to leave was made by a young man named Thomas Ellery, 23, an unmarried farmhand from Scioto County who had attached himself to the Harrowfield party at Westport and been hired by Absalom Harrowfield for the crossing at 15, 10 of which had already been paid. Ellery was a restless young man, more at ease on a moving horse than in any fixed place, and he had felt the pull of the valley less strongly than the others. Or, perhaps he had felt it, in a way his restlessness partially counteracted, the way an open window can partially counteract a room that has become too warm. On the morning of September 14th, he saddled his horse before sunrise and rode north along the river, intending to find the gap in the northern rim through which they had descended on August 31st, and follow it back to the Emigrant Road. He returned to camp at mid-afternoon. His horse was lathered, and he was pale in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The pallor of a man who has seen something that has rearranged his understanding of the world's basic dimensions. He did not speak for several hours. When he did speak, he told Caldwell, because Caldwell was who he trusted and who was waiting, that he had ridden north for what he estimated to be 6 hours and had not found the northern rim. The valley did not end to the north. It continued. The same valley, the same river, the same fir trees on the slopes, the same still air for as far as he had ridden. He had turned east then into the slope, thinking he could climb out over the ridge, and had climbed for what felt like 2 hours and reached a point from which he should have been able to see the surrounding country, and instead found himself looking down into the valley from above. The same valley. The camp visible in the distance below him, the smoke from the morning fires still pale against the fir trees. He had ridden back down. He did not know what he had seen. He knew what it meant, the northern exit. They had used to enter the valley was no longer where it had been, or was no longer accessible by any route he had been able to find, and he was asking Caldwell, with the specific desperation of a young man whose restlessness has finally been given a direction to push against, and found it pushes back, what they should do. Caldwell told him to say nothing to the others. He told him this not because he thought it was the right thing to do, but because he needed time to think, and because he had seen an expression on the faces of the families around the evening fire, something that told him that the news that the valley had no exit would not be received the way he expected it to be received. He had seen in those faces something beginning to look less like the contentment of tired travelers at rest, and more like the contentment of people who have stopped expecting to go anywhere, whose sense of elsewhere has been gently and thoroughly removed without their noticing, the way a very skilled thief removes a watch. That night he wrote in his notebook, by the light of a candle stub, the longest entry he had yet made in the crossing journal. He wrote about the valley and what Ellery had found. He wrote about the fish and the stone ring and the sound the valley refused to return. He wrote about the expression on Absalom Harrowfield's face when he had argued for departure, and the expression on Constance Fells's face when she looked at the western slope on the first morning. He wrote about the specific quality of the stillness, which he had by now spent 2 weeks analyzing with the methodical precision of a man once paid by the government to understand terrain, and which he had come to believe was not a natural feature of the enclosed geography, but something more active, more purposeful, more patient than anything a landform could be. He wrote near the end of the entry that he believed the valley was not a place in the ordinary sense of the word. He believed it was a condition, and he believed the longer a person remained in it, the more thoroughly the condition replaced whatever that person had previously understood themselves to be. He had seen it in the others. He was beginning to feel it in himself. The desire to ride north, to find the gap, to push through whatever was preventing exit was present in him. But it was present the way a memory is present, something he knew he had once wanted urgently, and could still access intellectually, but that had lost. In the daily experience of the valley, the visceral force that had originally accompanied it. He closed the notebook, blew out the candle, lay on his back, and looked up at the sky through the gap in his blanket roll. The stars were there, the same stars he had navigated by for 30 years, Polaris in its fixed position, the dipper hanging above the northern rim of the valley, and they looked, he would write the following morning, like a painting of stars, like something someone had arranged to be convincing, rather than something that had arranged itself to be true. He fell asleep before he had resolved this observation to his satisfaction and dreamed, for the first time in the valley, not of escape but of staying. The dream was so comfortable and so complete and so specifically tailored to the contents of his deepest private desires. The Springfield house, his daughters grown and well, a fire in a room with books, a life that had accumulated without damage into something whole and quiet. That when he woke in the dawn dark with his notebook open beside him, and his hand still holding the pencil, he had to remind himself carefully and with considerable effort who he was. The second attempt to leave the valley was made on September 21st, 3 weeks after the party had descended into it, and it was not made by one person but by 4, which Caldwell noted in his journal as significant. The theory being, though he did not state it explicitly, only circling it the way a man circles something, he is not yet ready to name directly, that the valley's hold on an individual was inversely proportional to the number of people that individual was in physical proximity to who shared the intention of leaving. As though the condition, which was how he had taken to thinking of it, operated most efficiently on persons in isolation, and was somewhat weakened, though not eliminated, when resistance was collective and simultaneous. It was a theory born of observation rather than understanding, and he knew it, and he wrote it down anyway, because the notebook had become, by that point in the crossing, the only place in the valley where he felt entirely himself, the act of writing having a clarifying effect on his thinking. The valley's atmosphere seemed unable to fully penetrate, as though the concentration required to put precise words to imprecise experience created a small interior space that was his own and that the valley had not yet learned to enter. The 4 who attempted to leave together were Thomas Ellery, who had not spoken of his first attempt to anyone but Caldwell and had spent the week since in a state of controlled agitation expressed in excessive work, splitting wood that did not need splitting, and digging trenches that served no drainage purpose. A man named Caleb Morrow, 38, a former river pilot from Gallia County, who had signed on with the Harrowfield party as a general laborer, and had the specific stubbornness of a man accustomed to navigating by landmarks rather than maps, making his own private observations of the valley's geography. With the navigator's habit of continuous spatial reckoning, Morrow's younger brother Isaac, 26, who followed his brother in most things and was, by his later account, less disturbed by the valley than the others, but more disturbed by his brother's disturbance, meaning it was loyalty rather than his own alarm that motivated him. And a woman named Pearl Guthrie, 44, the wife of a farmer named Edmund Guthrie from Ross County, who had come to Caldwell days earlier and told him in a flat and entirely calm voice that she knew what was happening and intended to leave, telling him not to ask his permission, but because she thought he should know, and because she wanted him to give her his notebook when she went so that if she made it out she could show someone what was in it. Caldwell had not given her the notebook. He told her instead what Ellery had found: the valley that did not end to the north, the ridge that returned a man to where he had started. Pearl Guthrie listened with the same flat calm, and said she had suspected as much and intended to try anyway, because the alternative, to remain in the valley and allow the condition, she used his word without him having used it in her presence, which alarmed him considerably, to complete whatever process it had begun on the night of August 31st, was not something she was prepared to accept. She had a daughter of 16 at home in Chillicothe, staying with her sister, waiting for a letter Pearl Guthrie had been trying to write for 3 weeks and could not finish, because every time she reached the part where she described the valley's location, Her hand stopped and her mind went sideways into a contentment so dense it was indistinguishable from forgetting. They left before dawn on the 21st, the four of them on horseback, carrying 3 days of provisions, and the compass Caleb Morrow had been maintaining with navigational obsessiveness since the crossing began. Caldwell watched them go from his bedroll without rising or calling after them. He watched until their shapes dissolved into the pre-dawn gray of the valley floor, then lay back and looked at the stars and waited for what he now believed was going to happen. They returned at mid-morning. Not mid-morning of the following day, as would have been expected if they had ridden a full night and part of a morning in any direction, but mid-morning of the same day, 4 hours after they had left. Their horses unhurried, their faces wearing the expression Caldwell had come to think of as the valley's expression. The slight softening around the eyes, the loosening of the jaw, the look of a person who has set down something heavy they had been carrying for a long time and has not yet realized the thing they set down was themselves. Pearl Guthrie dismounted without speaking, went to a wagon, lay down, and did not emerge until the following morning, at which point she was, in every observable sense, as settled in the valley as any of the 14 families. Her flatness and calm now, indistinguishable from the settled calm of a woman who has accepted a situation, rather than the resistant calm of a woman managing one. She never spoke to Caldwell again, not in any direct or meaningful way. She spoke to him the way all the valley people spoke to him by that point, pleasantly and from a slight distance, as though he were a neighbor they knew well enough, but not intimately, a person whose presence was familiar and unremarkable and whose departure, if it came, would be noted but not mourned. He had become, he realized, the last fully exterior person in the valley, the last one who retained something like the ordinary sense of being located in a specific place in a world that extended beyond that place. The loneliness of this position was of a kind he had not previously encountered and could not have anticipated. The loneliness not of isolation but of visibility, of being the only person in a room who can see what the room is doing to the other people in it, and who is unable to make any of those people see it, too. By October 1st, all 14 families had completed some form of permanent structure. The valley had provided with a generosity Caldwell continued to document in his notebook, and that continued to strike him as the most precisely calibrated aspect of the whole arrangement. Everything that was needed for construction, and nothing more. The timber was abundant, and the right species for building. The clay in the riverbank was suitable for chinking. The stones along the western slope were flat and stackable, and of a size that made them practical for chimneys and hearth foundations. Nothing in the valley was superfluous. Everything was exactly sufficient. It was the sufficiency, Caldwell wrote, that was the most persuasive argument for settlement. More persuasive than any land agent's pitch, because it was not an argument at all, but a demonstration. A daily physical material demonstration that the valley wanted them there, and had arranged itself accordingly. The most effective traps, he wrote, are the ones that feel like answers. He stopped trying to encourage departure by the second week of October. Not because he had given up entirely, but because he had recognized direct advocacy was counterproductive. The mention of leaving produced in the people he spoke to a response, not defensive, but evasive. A gentle changing of the subject, a looking away, a resumption of whatever task had been interrupted, as though the concept of departure were a word in a language they were in the process of forgetting, and were mildly embarrassed by their inability to recall. He shifted instead to a more oblique strategy, asking questions rather than making suggestions. raising the subject of Oregon City, or winter provisions that would require resupply, or of the families and friends, waiting for letters in Ohio and Kentucky, and watching for any crack in the settled surface. Any flicker of the old desire, any moment when the person he was speaking to seemed to remember, however briefly, that there was a world beyond the valley's rim. He found those moments occasionally, and always in the same circumstances. They came in the middle of the night, in the hour before dawn, which was also the hour the valley seemed fully present to itself. When the stillness was not its usual watchful stillness, but something thinner and less certain, as though the condition required rest the way a living organism requires rest, and was briefly, in those dark pre-dawn hours, less attentive than usual. He would hear, from inside the cabins and wagons, the sounds of people who were not sleeping. The restless turning, the half-suppressed sounds of crying, the murmuring of people speaking to themselves or to someone beside them in a voice too low to carry. Once, in the third week of October, he heard Catherine Harrowfield, through the log walls of the Harrowfield cabin, say her sister's name. He did not know she had a sister. He had read nothing in her journal, which he had never seen, about a sister. He heard her say the name twice, Louisa, in a voice of such particular and concentrated longing he had to set his hand against the cabin wall for a moment and hold himself still before he could walk on. It was the sound of a person who was in that specific moment fully and painfully aware of everything outside the valley, and who would be, he knew, by morning no longer aware of it at all. He began to have a theory about the nights and the pre-dawn hours in particular, and why the condition seemed thinner then. The theory was connected to his observation, consistent since the first night, that the valley made no echo, returned no sound, absorbed the acoustic evidence of human presence without remainder. He had come to believe, though he could not have said why, that what the valley was doing with the sounds it absorbed was something other than simply nullifying them. He believed it was using them. He believed the condition was, in some essential way, constructed from the materials of the people it contained, from their voices and habits, and desires and memories, and that the construction required continuous input. The way a fire requires continuous fuel, and the hours before dawn were the hours when the fuel ran lowest, when the input of the sleeping humans was at its minimum, and when, as a result, the condition was briefly and marginally less complete than during waking hours, when the full weight of 106 people's presence and attention and consent was available to it. Consent was the word he used deliberately and with full awareness of its weight. He believed, by October, that the condition required something that functioned like consent, not the explicit, considered consent of a person who has been given a choice and made one, but the passive consent of a person who has stopped resisting, a different thing and, he thought, considerably more insidious, because it was invisible both to the giver and perhaps to the thing receiving it. He thought of Pearl Guthrie telling him she knew what was happening. He thought of Constance Fells looking at the western slope with recognition on the first morning. He thought of Elijah Harrowfield saying his mother was looking in the wrong place. He thought of all the ways the people in the valley had demonstrated in those early days some level of awareness that something was happening to them, and of how that awareness had entirely vanished, replaced by the settled, sufficient, easeful contentment of people who had stopped asking what the valley was and accepted, without negotiation, what the valley told them they were. On October 14th, Caldwell made his own attempt to leave. He did it in the pre-dawn hours, alone, on foot rather than horseback, moving along the eastern slope, rather than the northern rim Ellery had tried. He carried his rifle, notebook, compass, and 2 days of provisions, moving in the thin dark, before the stars faded with the particular deliberateness of a man who had spent 30 years learning to move through difficult terrain without disturbing it. He climbed the eastern slope for what his sense of elapsed time told him was 4 hours. A climb that should have brought him well above the valley rim by any reasonable geographic calculation. And he reached, as Ellery had reached, and as he had expected to reach, a point from which he could see below him, and to the west the valley floor with its cabins and river and morning cook fires, beginning to glow in the dark, and from which he could see in every other direction, not the surrounding Oregon territory, but the valley again. The same valley, the same river, the same geometry of grass and fir and stone repeated or continued or reflected in a way that eliminated any distinction between inside the valley and outside it. He sat on the slope for a long time. The eastern sky lightened. The stars went out one by one. Below him the valley woke, and he could see the small figures of people moving between the cabins, the smoke rising from the fires. And he could hear, carried upward on the morning air, the sounds of the camp beginning its day, voices and the noise of livestock, and the particular sound of an axe striking wood that carries further in cold morning air than any other sound a camp makes. He could hear all of this clearly. The valley returned sound to him when he was on the slope. It was only within the valley floor that it absorbed sound without return, and he noted this in his notebook. Sitting on the slope with his back against a fir tree that smelled of cold resin and ordinary earth, noted it carefully and with the concentration of a man making use of the clarity, height, and distance and pre-dawn cold had given him, knowing that when he descended, which he was going to have to do, because he had nowhere else to go, some part of this clarity would be taken from him. He wrote in that entry on the slope the most coherent summary of his understanding of the valley he would produce in the entire period of his captivity, because captivity was the word he used, bracketed and underlined in that entry, having finally reached the point of naming it directly. He wrote that the valley was not a geographic feature, but a predatory condition of unknown origin, that used the landscape as a medium and had been doing so for an unknown period of time, long enough that the local indigenous people had named it and avoided it and built a body of practical knowledge about its behavior. He wrote that it operated by progressive substitution, replacing the interior life of its occupants, their memories, desires, intentions, and sense of the world beyond its rim, with a contentment so precisely calibrated to each individual's deepest needs that the substitution was, for most people, indistinguishable from satisfaction. He wrote that it was patient in a way that suggested either very long experience or a nature for which time operated differently than it did for its human occupants. He wrote that its preference for groups rather than individuals, which the Kalapuya knowledge had indicated, was consistent with his observations, and that he believed this preference was not incidental but essential, that the condition fed, in some way he could not specify, on the social bonds of the groups it contained, on the warmth and trust and mutual reinforcement of people living together in close quarters, who were, as a result, continuously supplying each other with reasons to stay. He wrote that the valley was very good at its work, and that its work was very old. Then he descended, because there was nowhere else to go, and because the families in the valley were his responsibility in a way he could not set aside, even in the face of what the valley was, and because the notebook was the work he had given himself to do. And the notebook could only be maintained if he was present, and because he had decided in the clear air of the slope that his purpose in the valley was not to escape it, but to document it, completely and without omission, so that if the notebook survived, which he intended to ensure by whatever means he could, the truth of what had happened to 106 people in the Oregon Territory in the autumn of 1847 would exist somewhere in a form the valley could not absorb. He reached the camp at mid-morning and went directly to his bedroll and felt, as he had expected to feel, the familiar atmospheric pressure of the valley settling back around him like water closing over a man who has briefly surfaced. He opened his notebook and read what he had written on the slope, reading carefully and thoroughly, committing it to memory with the deliberate effort of a man fixing a landmark in his mind before a fog comes in. Then he closed the notebook, put it inside his shirt, and went to help Jonas Birch with the construction of the roof on the Birch family cabin, and was, for the rest of that day, as useful and present and apparently settled as any other man in the valley. Winter came to the valley in the third week of October, earlier than Caldwell had expected from the elevation and latitude, and with a completeness suggesting, as everything in the valley suggested, intentionality. The cold arrived in a single night, dropping from the cool autumn temperatures that had prevailed since September to a deep, sustained cold that frosted the ground and filmed the river's slower eddies with ice by morning. Snow followed 3 days later. Not the tentative early snow of a mountain autumn, but a full and serious snowfall that covered the valley floor to a depth of 8 inches in a single day and showed no sign of stopping. By the end of October, the valley was enclosed in white, the fir trees on the slopes dark pillars in a white landscape, and the river, still open and still cold and still unaccountably well stocked with fish, was the only moving thing in a world that had simplified itself to its essential components: sky, tree, snow, river, smoke. 14 families in 14 rough cabins gathered against the cold with their children and livestock and provisions, and there settled, easeful, sufficient contentment. Caldwell spent the winter in a lean to shelter he had constructed against the north wall of the Harrowfield cabin, close enough to the family for warmth and safety, but separate enough to maintain the slight distance his exterior status had come to require. He was treated by all 14 families with a uniform, pleasant, uninquisitive kindness he had come to recognize as the valley's way of managing the one person it had not yet fully claimed. He was fed. He was included in communal gatherings. He was spoken to with warmth, and without any apparent awareness that he was different from the others. Or rather, with an awareness of his difference, smoothed into something social, rather than existential, as though his failure to fully settle were a personal eccentricity, a mild and harmless oddity, rather than the only evidence the world outside the valley still existed. He wrote every day. He wrote in the smallest possible handwriting to conserve pages of his notebook. When the notebook was full, he began writing on the blank end papers and then on the inside covers. When those were full, he smoothed the bark of fir branches and wrote on them with a charred stick, numbering every piece and storing them in the water-proof oilskin pouch he had carried since his army surveying days. He kept the pouch inside his shirt at all times, which was not comfortable but necessary, because he had observed early in the winter that objects left unattended in the valley had a tendency to be in different positions when their owners returned to them. Never dramatically displaced, never obviously interfered with, but shifted in the small ways that suggested they had been examined and replaced by hands that were not their owners. The children were the hardest part of the winter, not because they were suffering. They were not. They were warmly housed and well fed, and as physically healthy as children who had just completed a 5-month overland crossing could reasonably be expected to be. But because they were the most completely settled of all the valley's occupants, the most thoroughly substituted, having had less prior life to replace. He watched them play in the snow on the valley floor and noted in his bark written observations that they played differently than children played in the world outside. Their play was quieter, more contained. The running and shouting and elaborate social negotiations of children at play, the arguments and alliances and tears and recoveries, were all present but muted, as though someone had turned the volume down to a level still audible, but lacking the full register of ordinary childhood. They were happy. He was certain they were happy. He was not certain their happiness was entirely their own. Spring came to the valley on a specific morning in what Caldwell calculated, by his careful maintenance of a day, count scratch record on the inside of his oilskin pouch, to be the second week of March 1848, 6.5 months after the party had descended from the eastern rim. It came the same way winter had come, not gradually, not with the tentative advances and retreats of an ordinary seasonal change, but completely in a single day, as though the valley had decided winter, was finished and implemented that decision without consultation. He woke to birdsong not present the evening before, to the sound of meltwater running in channels along the base of the western slope, to air that smelled of thaumonaried earth and new growth, and something underneath those smells he had come to associate specifically with the valley's active periods. A faint organic sweetness he could not identify by any plant or animal source, first noticed on the night of August 31st, when the camp had woken all at once and turned toward the western slope. He wrote about the smell in his bark records, trying to describe it with the precision a surveyor would bring to the description of a landscape feature. Something between pine resin and river mud, and something else entirely. Something with no analog in his experience of the natural world. Something that suggested, without being identifiable, as the smell of a living thing that was very large and very old and very still. He had smelled it most strongly in the pre-dawn hours on the nights when the valley seemed thinnest, and had come to believe, in the way a man comes to believe things he cannot prove, but cannot dismiss, that it was the smell of the condition itself, or of whatever generated the condition, or whatever the condition was a manifestation of, and its intensification in the spring was connected to whatever the valley did with the people it kept through the winter. Whatever process the long cold months had accomplished in the interior lives of 106 human beings, who had spent 6 months eating the valley's fish and breathing the valley's air and sleeping the valley's sleep. What the spring revealed over the days and weeks following that first warm morning was a community, not a collection of families camped in proximity and enduring their situation together, which was what Caldwell had observed through the winter, but something more coherent and troubling, a genuine community in the social sense, with organic interconnections and shared understandings and implicit hierarchies that communities develop over years, not months. The 14 families had over the winter formed bonds with the texture of long, established relationships, the specific charm of people who have known each other for decades and developed through that long knowing a shared language of gesture and implication and unspoken understanding that makes explicit communication largely unnecessary. He saw it in the way they moved around each other, without negotiation, in the way decisions were made by the community without any visible process of deliberation, in the way conflicts, when they arose, were resolved not by argument but by a mutual adjustment so smooth and rapid an outside observer would not have been able to identify a conflict had occurred. Absalom Harrowfield had become, without any election or appointment Caldwell had observed, the community's de facto leader. Not in the way of a man who has sought authority, but in the way of a man to whom authority has been given by the consensus of people who have agreed, without discussing it, that he is the right person to receive it. He presided over the communal gatherings, the evening fires that had become a nightly ritual through the winter, with a natural ease bearing no resemblance to the careful, slightly uncertain man Caldwell remembered from the crossing. He spoke with a confidence not of a man performing authority, but of a man who has been told something privately and thoroughly about his own fitness for a role and who has accepted that telling without reservation. His wife, Catherine, had stopped keeping her journal in January. Caldwell had noticed its absence before he understood what it meant. The way you notice a sound has stopped without immediately registering it had been a measure of something. George Beaumont was still recognizably himself in some ways, still wearing his judicial coat to the evening fires, still producing the daguerreotype of his late wife from his breast pocket at intervals. But the way he held the daguerreotype had changed. The scrutiny with which he examined it different from the raw grief of the crossing, softer, more abstract, as though his wife's face were a face he was being reminded of rather than a face he was remembering. His son Nathaniel had become the community's most productive builder, directing the construction of communal structures. A larger meeting hall, a shared smokehouse, a covered well, with a focused competence impressive by any standard and applied, Caldwell noted, entirely to the valley's needs, never to any structure or project that pointed outward, never to anything suggesting the community anticipated movement or contact with any world beyond the valley's rim. Dorothea Fells had stopped writing in April. Her journal ended mid-sentence on the 14th of the month. In the middle of a description of the quality of the light on the western slope in the early morning, which had become, by her account, extraordinarily beautiful. A quality of light she had never seen anywhere else, soft and amber and somehow interior, as though emerging from the slope rather than falling upon it. The sentence ended with the words, "And beneath the light there is," and nothing more. A half-formed observation interrupted by something the journal did not record and Dorothea Fells never completed because she never wrote in the journal again. Her sister Constance, who had kept no journal and made no apparent effort to record or resist or analyze anything that happened in the valley, was by April the most fully settled person in the community, the one who seemed to Caldwell most at home, most at ease, most entirely, and without remainder at peace with where she was and what surrounded her to a degree that occasionally made the other settlers, even in their own settled states, glance at her sideways. It was Constance Fells who spoke to Caldwell directly about the valley, the only person who did. In the second week of May, she came to his lean, on an evening the rest of the community was gathered at the fire and sat on the ground outside his shelter with her knees drawn up and her hands folded on them. The same posture Dorian Virginia had described in the letter never sent, the posture of that first night in the valley. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking, with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a person who has no social anxiety about sustained eye contact, because she has nothing to hide and nothing to perform. Then she said, in a voice perfectly ordinary and entirely calm, that she knew he was still writing things down, and she wanted him to know she didn't mind. She said this without any accusatory weight, the way a person might mention, without judgment, they had noticed a neighbor's habit of rising early. He asked her what she thought he was writing down. She said she knew what he was writing down, and it was important it survive, and she wanted him to make sure it did. He asked if she understood what the valley was. She considered the question for a moment, not as though deciding whether to answer, but as though translating something from a language that didn't map precisely onto English. Then she said understanding was probably not the right word for what she had. What she had was closer to acceptance. And acceptance of something and understanding of it were not the same thing, and she had stopped needing them to be. He asked if she wanted to leave. She said the question didn't quite apply to her anymore. He asked if she had wanted to leave in the beginning. She said in the beginning she had wanted, very specifically, with a clarity she could still access though not feel, to go home to Xenia, Ohio, sit in her father's kitchen, drink coffee from her father's blue cup, listen to her father read aloud from the Bible after supper, the way he had every evening of her childhood. She said she still knew she had wanted that. She said the knowing was intact. She said it was only the wanting that was gone. He asked about the western slope, about what she had seen on the first morning and the first night. She was quiet for longer than she had been for any of the other questions. Then she said she had not seen anything on the western slope in the way. Seeing implied a discrete object in a specific location. What she had experienced was more like recognition of a presence, not located in the slope specifically, but that used the slope and the fir trees on the slope, and the stillness behind the fir trees as a kind of address, the way a person uses a building's facade as the address of whatever is inside the building, which is not the same as saying the person lives in the facade. She said the presence was very old, and it did not experience time the way people did. Its patience was not the patience of a thing waiting, but the patience of a thing for which waiting and having were not distinct conditions. She said it was not cruel. She said she wanted him to write that down specifically. It was not cruel. It was complete in a way that made cruelty beside the point. The way a mountain is not cruel to the things that live on it, though it does not adjust itself for them. He wrote it down. He wrote down everything she said that evening and in the days that followed, because she was the only person in the valley who would speak to him directly about what the valley was, and because what she said, filtered through the acceptance she had described, had a clarity his own observations, filtered through his resistance, sometimes lacked. She came to his lean to 4 more times over the spring and summer of 1848, always in the evening, always alone, always in the same posture. She spoke to him about the valley with a candor and specificity he came to believe was not incidental but deliberate. That she was, in these conversations, fulfilling some function the valley had assigned to her. That the valley wanted its own record kept, and had arranged for someone fully inside it, and fully articulate to provide Caldwell with what he needed to make that record complete. He did not know what to do with this belief, and so he wrote it down too, and let it sit in the oilskin pouch with everything else. The summer of 1848 passed in the valley, with the same sufficiency, and the same beauty, and the same complete absence of any event pointing outward. Children were born, 2 of them, healthy infants delivered by a midwife from the Pendleton family, who had served in that capacity in Ross County for 20 years. Crops were planted and grew with a consistency exceeding anything the farmers in the party had experienced in Ohio or Kentucky. The valley soil producing yields Jonas Birch, who had added agricultural observation to his veterinary documentation by that point. Described in private notes Caldwell found after Birch had stopped keeping them in the autumn, as not physically impossible, but statistically very unlikely. The kind of yields requiring a combination of soil quality, water availability, and weather conditions that did not typically occur in nature. A man from the Tilson family, Robert Tilson, broke his arm in July falling from a roof beam, and was well and working again within 3 weeks, a rate of healing the former veterinarian noted without comment. Caldwell wrote about all of it. He continued his perimeter walks, his pre-dawn vigils at the edge of the camp. He continued to feel, in those pre-dawn hours, the thinning of the condition, the slight loosening, and continued to hear from inside the cabins the sounds of people who were, in that specific window of dark and cold, briefly and incompletely aware of what they had lost. In the second week of September 1848, exactly 1 year after the party had entered the valley, Elias Caldwell hid his notebook and bark records and oilskin pouch in a location he described in the final entry with a care and specificity suggesting he spent considerable time choosing both the location and the language used to describe it, wanting the description precise enough that a person who found the notebook would be able to find the cache. Without being so explicit, a casual reader would immediately understand it. The entry is written in a combination of standard notation and a private shorthand he had developed during his Army surveying years, the interpretation of which has occupied Patricia Vane and 2 other researchers across a period of 40 years, with results that have been the subject of, at last count, 11 private academic disputes and 1 published disagreement in a journal of Pacific Northwest history that generated 3 responses and a correction and settled nothing. What is not disputed is what the final entry of the notebook says directly. In plain language, before it shifts into the private shorthand, it says Caldwell intends to cross the valley that night alone, on foot, without provisions, moving along the western slope rather than any route previously attempted. It says he has decided, based on observations of the valley's behavior across 13 months of captivity, that the western slope is not a boundary but an interior. That whatever the condition is, its source or center or primary location is not beneath the valley floor or in the valley air, but inside the slope itself, behind the fir trees, in the specific geography of the high ground above the tree line, and he intends to move toward it, rather than away from it, on the theory, which he acknowledges is untested and may be entirely wrong, that a trap preventing exit from its exterior may not prevent movement toward its interior, that the condition may not be designed to stop a person from approaching what generates it, only from leaving what it has generated. He says in the final plain language section he understands he may not return from the western slope, that he may find what he is looking for and be unable to leave it, or may find nothing and be returned to the camp the way the 4 who attempted escape in September of 1847 were returned, unhurt and settled, and no longer interested in leaving. He says if he does not return, the notebook and the cache will remain where he has hidden them, and the valley, being what it is, will not move them, because the valley does not interfere with the documentary record. This being, he writes, the one thing Constance Fells said that has troubled him most in the 13 months he has known her. The implication the condition wants its own record, that it has some purpose in being documented, he does not understand. And that may not be consistent with the purposes of the people he has been documenting it for. He was not in the camp the following morning. He was not in the camp the morning after that, or in any of the mornings that followed through the autumn and winter of 1848 and 1849. His lean to shelter stood empty. His bedroll remained folded on his sleeping mat. His rifle, which he had decided in the last days before his departure had no use for on the western slope, were propped against the inside wall of the lean-to. Nobody in the community of the 14 families moved it or asked about it or appeared by any behavior Caldwell was there to observe to register his absence as a loss. They continued their communal life in the valley with the same sufficiency and the same ease. The evening fires continued. The children continued to play in the muted way of valley children. The crops continued to exceed what soil and climate should have been able to produce. The western slope continued to stand at the valley's edge, dark with fir trees, still with its particular watchful stillness, giving nothing back. Elias Caldwell's notebook was found in 1908 by a surveying party working for the Northern Pacific Railway, mapping a section of the Oregon Territory for a proposed branch line extension, subsequently abandoned, which is why the survey was never published, and the notebook sat in the surveying company's archive in Portland for 15 years before being noticed by a clerk named Arthur Fenwick, who recognized its historical significance and brought it to the attention of the Oregon Historical Society in 1923. The society examined it and determined it was authentic, consistent with materials and writing instruments available in 1847, and that its account of the Harrowfield party's fate was coherent and internally consistent. Though the society also determined, in an internal memorandum not made public until 1967, that the account was, quote, of a nature that would invite public misinterpretation, if published without extensive contextual framing, and the appropriate course of action was to house the notebook in the Society's restricted collection and commission a scholarly study of the events it described. The scholarly study was commissioned in 1924 and assigned to a historian at the University of Oregon named Daniel Marsh, son of the ethnographer Josephine Marsh, who had interviewed the Kalapuya man Thomas in 1904 and had therefore grown up in a household where the Harrowfield Valley and its history had been a subject of private, careful, and always inconclusive discussion. Daniel Marsh spent 4 years on the study. He traveled twice to the region where the valley was believed to be located, making the second trip in the company of a Kalapuya cultural consultant, an elderly man named George Yoncalla, who knew the oral traditions surrounding the swallowing place and agreed to accompany Marsh as far as the eastern rim, which they reached on the morning of the second day of their approach, and from which Yoncalla refused to descend. Sitting on a boulder at the rim's edge and looking down into the valley below, with the specific expression of a man looking at something he has known about his whole life and hoped not to have to see directly. The valley was there. The valley was as Caldwell's notebook described it, approximately 6 miles across and 12 miles long, ringed with Douglas fir, bisected by a clear, fast river. It appeared from the rim to be empty. Marsh climbed down alone. He returned to the rim at dusk. He did not speak for several minutes after rejoining Yoncalla on the boulder. Then, he said the valley was empty in the sense that no living people were visible in it, but not empty in the sense that it showed no evidence of occupation. The remains of structures were visible along the river. 14 clusters of collapsed timber and stone corresponding in arrangement to the 14 families Caldwell's notebook described. A larger structure corresponding to the meeting hall Nathaniel Beaumont had directed the construction of was the most substantial ruin, its walls still partially standing, its roof long since fallen inward. The valley was full of a silence Marsh described in his unpublished study as total and directional, meaning not merely the absence of sound, but the active presence of something oriented. That had a direction to it, that seemed to be attending to him, the way a living thing attends to something it has noticed entering its space. He found in the ruins of the largest cabin, which Yoncalla confirmed from his description corresponded to the Harrowfield structure, a small leather journal wedged beneath a collapsed wall timber. It was Catherine Harrowfield's. Marsh was able to read the entries up to January of 1848, at which point the journal stopped. The final entry being a list of provisions required for the remainder of the winter. Written in a handwriting so different from the careful, precise handwriting of the crossing journal entries, Marsh initially believed it was a different person's document. Before confirming by comparison of earlier and later entries, it was the same hand altered. But alteration not of illnage or a person who between the crossing entries and the winter entries becomes someone from whom the acting was writing was no longer what it had previously been, for whom the memory was no longer what it had previously been. No longer the act of a person translating interior experience into language, but something more like marking the surface of a thing, functional and without depth. Marsh submitted his study to the Oregon Historical Society in 1928. The Society's board reviewed and declined to publish, citing concerns about the study's conclusions, which Marsh had stated plainly, and without qualification, that the valley described in Caldwell's notebook was a genuine geographic location exhibiting properties inconsistent with any known natural phenomenon. The 106 members of the Harrowfield wagon train had entered that location in August of 1847 and not left it in any conventional sense. The question of what the valley had done with them over the months and years following their arrival was not one the historical record was sufficient to answer. The Society filed Marsh's study in the same restricted collection as Caldwell's notebook, where both remained until 1967, when the collection was partially opened as part of a broader archival review. Patricia Vane encountered both documents in 1978 during her doctoral research at the University of Oregon. She spent 11 years on the subject, longer than any previous researcher, and produced a manuscript of 340 pages her doctoral committee passed with reservations and 2 university presses declined to publish. One after editorial review taking 14 months and producing a reader's report, whose concluding paragraph said only that the manuscript presented its evidence carefully and its conclusions responsibly, and the subject matter was of a kind making publication in a conventional academic context impossible without consequences for the press. The reader was not in a position to specify, but the press should consider carefully. Vane published privately in 1991 in an edition of 200 copies, most sent to university libraries and historical societies across the Pacific Northwest. A copy reached the Oregon Historical Society's open collection in 1993, where it sat on a shelf in the regional history section for 11 years before being requested by a researcher for the first time. The valley is still there. This is not a rhetorical statement. The valley described in Caldwell's notebook, confirmed by Daniel Marsh in 1928 and by Patricia Vane in 1982 during her single research visit, from which she returned with the specific paleness of a person who has looked at something that has looked back, is a real location in the Oregon Territory, accessible by foot from a trailhead not marked on any public map, and known among the small number of people who know about it by the direction of approach, rather than by any name. Vane describes in her manuscript the experience of standing on the eastern rim and looking down as Marsh had stood and as Caldwell's first settlers had stood on the morning of August 31st, 1847, and feeling with a specificity she found difficult to attribute to imagination that the valley was aware of a presence and had already, on the basis of that awareness, formed an opinion about whether she would be a suitable addition to whatever it was currently maintaining in its interior. She did not descend. She made this decision on the rim and has not changed it in the years since, and she has not returned to the rim either. When asked about this, she says only that she has read Caldwell's notebook many times, and there is one passage in it she considers the most important passage in the entire document. More important than his geographic descriptions. More important than his analysis of the condition. More important than his account of Constance Fells. More important even than the final entry and its hidden directions. And that passage is the one in which Caldwell describes, lying on his back on the valley floor, in the early weeks of captivity, and looking up at the stars, thinking they looked like a painting of stars, like something arranged to be convincing, rather than something that had arranged itself to be true. She says she thinks about that passage because she thinks it describes the essential mechanism, the way the valley works, and why it works, and why it is very difficult to resist. It takes what is real, what you know and love, and have built your sense of the world upon, and it makes a version of it that is complete and sufficient and beautiful and arranged specifically for you. And it offers you that version as a gift, and the gift is genuine in its way, which is what makes refusing it so difficult. Because to refuse it, you have to be willing to choose the real world, with all its inadequacy and loss and distance, over a version made with enormous patience and very old skill to be exactly what you would have chosen if you had been given the choice. Most people given that choice do not choose the real world. Caldwell understood this. It is why he wrote everything down. It is why the notebook survived. It is the one thing the valley did not account for, or perhaps the one thing it decided to allow, which may be the same thing. The ruins on the valley floor have not been excavated. No formal archaeological investigation has been conducted. The question of what happened to the 106 members of the Harrowfield wagon train after the autumn of 1848 remains, in the strictest sense, open. The land is not designated as any kind of protected site. It appears on no registry of historical locations. The descendants of the 14 families, those who did not make the crossing, who stayed behind in Ohio and Kentucky, who waited for letters that never came, who filed the missing persons reports that produced Augustus Trevelyan's careful register, and then Trevelyan's transfer, and then 60 years of silence. Those descendants are scattered now across the country, living ordinary lives in ordinary places, most unaware they had ancestors who walked into a valley in Oregon in 1847, and that those ancestors are, in some sense the available documentation consistently declines to specify, still there. There is one exception. A woman in Eugene, Oregon, whose name Patricia Vane gives in her manuscript only as M, and who came to Vane's attention through a genealogical society's records in 1985, and who is a great-great-granddaughter of Seth Crane, the brother-in-law of Absalom Harrowfield, who had stayed behind in Muskingum County when the wagon train departed. This woman told Vane, in a single meeting Vane describes as the most difficult interview she conducted in 11 years of research, that she had been dreaming of the valley since childhood. In the dream always standing on the eastern rim, looking down, and the valley below full of light and of people she did not know but recognized. And always in the dream a moment when one of the people below looked up and saw her, and the expression on that person's face was not the expression of a person waiting to be found, but the expression of a person waiting to be joined. And she had never, in any of the many times she had stood on that dream rim looking down at that dream valley, found the refusal easy. Vane asked if she had ever looked for the valley in the waking world. The woman said she had driven the roads of the surrounding area twice in different years, and on the second occasion found what she believed was the trailhead, unmarked, and sat in her car at the edge of the road for a long time looking at the path leading into the trees. Vane asked if she had walked it. The woman said no. Vane asked why not. The woman was quiet for a moment. then said she had a daughter of 7 at home, and a husband and a house with a kitchen. She had painted yellow the previous summer, and she sat at the edge of that unmarked road and thought about all of those things with the specific, fierce, deliberately summoned clarity of a person using the real world as a talisman against something. And then she started her car and drove home. She said she had not gone back. She said she thought about it. She said she thought about it most strongly in the late summer. In the particular quality of light the Pacific Northwest produces in August. The long golden late summer light falling at the angle and with the same warmth as the light Catherine Harrowfield had described in the journal entry of August 31st, 1847, as something she recognized without having seen it before. The woman said she understood, when that light came, why her ancestors had looked down into the valley and felt something Catherine Harrowfield had called, for want of a better word, recognition. She said she felt it too. She said she suspected she would always feel it. She said she had decided, for the sake of the daughter of 7 and the husband in the yellow kitchen, to feel it from a sufficient distance. She said she hoped the distance would be sufficient. She said she was not entirely certain it would be. The valley does not appear on any current map. It receives no visitors that any record reflects. The river still runs through it. The fir trees are still on the slopes. The ruins on the valley floor are older now by nearly 180 years, and the timber has returned over them, and the grass has grown through them, and the valley has incorporated them into its landscape, the way it incorporates everything, completely and without remainder. Somewhere in the location Caldwell described in his private shorthand in the final entry of his notebook. A location 3 researchers have attempted to identify and none has been able to confirm. There is a waterproof oilskin containing a account of everything that happened to 106 people in that valley between August of 1847 and September of 1840, August of 1848. The account is complete. The account is accurate. The account is waiting. With the patience of something that has learned patience from a very old teacher. To be found by whoever is willing to go looking for it. If you are the kind of person who reads about forgotten valleys and lost wagon trains and 108-year-old mysteries and feels, underneath the ordinary rational response, a pull that is not quite curiosity, and not quite longing but something in between, something with no good name in any language you know, then you already understand why 106 people looked down from the eastern rim on the morning of August 31st, 1847 and did not turn back. You understand it because you feel it too. The only question that has ever mattered in this story is what you intend to do with it.